Picture a bustling medieval market. Place the air thick with the scent of freshly dyed fabrics, the sound of hammers shaping metal, the vibrant colors of hand-woven tapestries. This wasn't just commerce. It was a world meticulously orchestrated by the unseen hands of trade guilds. Long before factories and corporations, these organizations held the keys to power, shaping not just economies, but the very fabric of society. They decided who could work, what quality meant, even how much a loaf of bread should cost. But their influence went far beyond the workshop. Guilds were kingdoms within kingdoms, with their own laws, secrets, and even armies. How did these groups rise to such dominance, and what shadows of their legacy still linger in our modern workplaces? The story of trade guilds is one of human ingenuity and ambition, a tale where craftsmanship and cunning intertwined. Imagine a young apprentice in 14th century Florence, spending years mastering the art of goldsmithing under the watchful eye of guild masters. His future, his very right to earn a living, depended on their approval. But guilds weren't just about skill, they were about survival. In a world without labor laws or safety nets, they offered protection, community, and a path to prosperity. Yet behind their noble ideals lurked darker truth, rivalries so fierce they sparked city-wide riots, rituals so secret that outsiders risked their lives to uncover them. This was a world where a weaver's stitch could be as powerful as a king's decree. What makes guilds truly fascinating isn't just their historical footprint, it's how eerily familiar their struggles feel today. The fight for fair wages, the tension between innovation and tradition, even the debates over who gets to call themselves a master of their craft, these aren't modern inventions. They're echoes of a system that thrived centuries ago. As we peel back the layers of guild life, you'll discover how their triumphs and failures shaped everything from modern unions to your favorite artisan coffee shop. This isn't just a journey into the past, it's a mirror held up to the present. So let's step into the guild halls of history and uncover the hidden forces that still whisper in the corridors of power today. To understand how trade guilds became so powerful, we need to travel back to a time when cities were just waking up from the Dark Ages. Picture the narrow streets of 11th century Paris or Venice crowded with merchants, alive with the clatter of tools, the shouts of traders haggling over wool, spices, and glass. In this chaotic world, skilled workers faced a constant struggle: how to protect their crafts from cheap imitations, how to train the next generation fairly, and how to keep their families fed when droughts, wars, or plagues could wipe out demand overnight. The solution: banding together. The earliest guilds weren't just trade associations, they were lifelines. Some grew from religious groups where craftsmen pledged mutual aid in the name of a patron saint. Others sprouted from merchant alliances, like the wine sellers of Cologne or the silk weavers of Byzantium, who pooled resources to guard against bandits and crooked tax collectors. But what truly set guilds apart was their dual role as both regulators and defenders. They set strict standards. A baker caught selling undersized loaves might face fines or public shaming. A dyer whose colors faded too quickly could lose his right to work. This wasn't just about quality control, it was about trust. In an age without trademarks or consumer laws, guild seals became badges of reliability. Yet guilds also served as medieval social safety nets. If a member fell ill, the guild covered his medical bills. If he died, it paid for his funeral and supported his widow. Apprenticeships, often starting as young as 12, weren't just job training, they were a path out of poverty, with masters legally bound to feed, house, and teach their charges. But this system had a dark edge. Guilds guarded their privileges fiercely. In 15th century London, a tailor working without guild approval might have his tools confiscated or his shop burned. Rivalries between guilds could turn violent, like the bloody clashes between fishmongers and butchers in medieval Strasbourg. What's astonishing is how universal this model was. Half a world away, in Song Dynasty China, porcelain guilds in Jingdezhen controlled access to coveted cobalt blue pigments, while in ancient Rome, collegia of builders and shipwrights negotiated with emperors for tax breaks. The parallels reveal a truth about human societies. Wherever specialized skills exist, people find ways to organize, protect, and sometimes monopolize them. By the 12th century, guilds weren't just part of the economy, they were the economy. Kings and city councils relied on them to collect taxes, train soldiers, even fund public works. To be outside a guild was to be invisible. This wasn't just medieval Europe's story. From the goldsmiths of Timbuktu to the spice traders of Constantinople, guilds shaped civilizations in ways we're still untangling today. Their legacy lingers in everything from modern apprenticeship programs to the very idea of a professional license. But perhaps their most enduring lesson is how easily protection can tilt into exclusion, a tension every society still grapples with. The guild system wasn't just a workplace hierarchy. It was a meticulously crafted ladder where every rung came with its own rituals, rites, and roadblocks. At the base stood the apprentices, often children as young as 7, handed over by their families in solemn ceremonies. Their lives were far from easy. Mornings began before dawn, sweeping workshops and preparing tools. Nights spent memorizing techniques by candlelight. But this grueling initiation served a purpose. A 7-year apprenticeship wasn't just about skill. It was a test of endurance, weeding out those who lacked the discipline to ascend. The best part, apprentices earned no wages, just food, lodging, and the promise of one day holding a chisel or loom as a free craftsman. Midway up the ladder, journeymen, literally day workers, faced a different challenge. Having completed their apprenticeships, they now earned wages but couldn't yet open their own shops. Instead, they wandered from city to city, a practice called the Wanderjahr in German guilds. This wasn't medieval tourism, it was education by exposure. A journeyman mason might study cathedral construction in Chartres, then learn new quarrying techniques in Salzburg, collecting secrets like trading cards. But here's the catch: to become a master, he'd need more than experience. Most guilds demanded a masterpiece, not just any project, but one so flawless it would silence even the most critical elders. In 16th century Nuremberg, a locksmith's masterpiece might be an ornate, puzzle-like lock that took months to craft, only to be judged by masters who'd scrutinize every pin and spring. At the pinnacle sat the masters, the elite who controlled guild politics. Elected wardens patrolled markets like medieval quality inspectors, wielding measuring rods and scales to enforce standards. A Frankfurt baker caught using cheap flour might find himself locked in the Schandkorb, a humiliating public cage. But guild leaders also brokered peace. When two master weavers in Bruges disputed over a client, the wardens mediated, their word as binding as any court's. This power came with perks. Masters attended secretive guild hall feasts, their tables laden with roasted swans and spiced wine, while discussing deals that shaped entire industries. Yet this system had cracks. The path from apprentice to master grew narrower over time, as established families guarded their status. By the Renaissance, some guilds demanded exorbitant fees for mastership, equivalent to a journeyman's decade of wages. Others required candidates to marry a master's widow, leading to strategic and sometimes loveless unions. In Ghent, rebellious journeymen formed underground compagnionages, staging strikes centuries before labor unions. The very structure meant to ensure fairness often bred resentment, with younger craftsmen accusing elders of hoarding opportunities. What's remarkable is how these medieval hierarchies mirror modern professional barriers. The masterpiece, think of today's bar exams or medical boards, the journeyman's wanderings, not unlike internships or cross-training programs. Even guild politics find echoes in modern licensing boards that debate who gets to call themselves an architect or electrician. The guild system's genius and its flaw was its belief that excellence could be institutionalized. It produced breathtaking craftsmanship but also gate-kept talent, a tension we've never fully resolved. When you hear debates about who belongs in a profession today, you're hearing the distant murmur of guild halls past. Guilds didn't just influence markets, they were the market. Imagine walking into 15th century Florence, where the price of bread, the width of a bolt of wool, even the number of nails in a shoemaker's stall were all dictated by guild statutes. These organizations didn't ask for control, they demanded it. A silk weaver in Lyon couldn't simply set up shop. He needed the guild's blessing, a costly membership, and approval for every thread he used. The penalty for ignoring these rules: confiscated goods, shattered tools, or worse. In an era before antitrust laws, guilds operated like medieval cartels, enforcing production quotas to keep prices high. When Flemish cloth guilds noticed too many weavers flooding the market, they'd slash workdays to create artificial scarcity, sending the cost of woolens soaring. But their power extended far beyond local stalls. Guilds were the original lobbyists, bending city councils to their will. In Venice, the glassmakers of Murano, famed for their secret crystal recipes, convinced the Doge to pass a law forbidding craftsmen from leaving the island. Anyone caught smuggling glass-blowing knowledge abroad risked assassination. Meanwhile, London's fishmongers wielded such influence that their guild hall became a shadow treasury, loaning money to kings in exchange for tax exemptions. This wasn't just business, it was geopolitical chess. When the Hanseatic League, a super guild of German merchants, boycotted Norwegian timber in the 13th century, entire villages faced starvation, proving guilds could strangle economies with a single decree. Yet for all their ruthlessness, guilds also provided stability. In a world without minimum wage laws, they set fair pay scales. A journeyman carpenter in medieval York earned enough to feed his family, thanks to guild-mandated rates. They punished masters who skimped on materials, like the Parisian bakers fined for diluting flour with sawdust. And when plagues wiped out workers, guilds rebuilt trades by funding orphan apprenticeships. This delicate dance between monopoly and protection created economies that thrived for centuries. The irony: many modern industries still operate on guild-like principles. Tech giants guard patents like medieval trade secrets, unions negotiate wages much like guild wardens, and artisanal coffee roasters control supply chains with the precision of spice merchants in Constantinople. The next time you see a certified organic label or hear about a licensing exam, you're witnessing the ghost of guilds past still shaping who gets to sell, what counts as quality, and who holds the keys to the marketplace. Beneath the ledger books and workshop rules, guilds pulsed with something far more human, a beating heart of community. Walk into any medieval city on the feast day of St. Crispin, patron of cobblers, and you'd find streets transformed. Shoemakers paraded in embroidered robes, carrying relics of the saint alongside displays of their finest boots, while the air filled with the scent of roasted meats and spiced ale. These weren't just celebrations, they were public declarations of identity. A guild's wealth wasn't measured solely in coin, but in the grandeur of its processions, the stained glass windows it donated to cathedrals, the alms it distributed to the poor. In an age before social media, these spectacles were how trades proclaimed their worth not just to customers but to God. The Guildhall itself was a theater of belonging. Imagine stepping inside during a winter feast. Long tables groaned under pies shaped like guild emblems, while masters and apprentices shared trenchers of bread for the first time as equals. These meals weren't mere revelry, they reinforced hierarchies through ritual. In London's Skinner's Guild, apprentices served wine on bended knee, learning their place even as they joined the toast. Yet guilds also dissolved barriers when it mattered. When plague struck, they became early first responders. The Venetian silk weavers maintained a hospice for sick members, while Frankfurt stonemasons funded orphanages. This duality, strict order paired with communal care, made guilds paradoxically rigid and nurturing, like stern parents who discipline you by day but sit vigil at your sick by night. Their spiritual footprint ran equally deep. Guilds commissioned altarpieces featuring themselves at the foot of the cross, like the Hamburg brewers who paid for a painting of the Last Supper, with beer jugs discreetly placed beside the apostles. Some trades took this further. The Parisian candle makers' guild claimed their wax purified sin, while English wool merchants funded chantry priests to pray for their souls in perpetuity. This wasn't just piety, it was spiritual branding, tying earthly crafts to divine favor. Even their tools became sacred objects. A blacksmith's hammer might be blessed annually, while masons whispered that their compasses held echoes of Solomon's temple. What's often overlooked is how these cultural tentacles reached into daily life. Guilds dictated fashion. Butchers in Toulouse wore distinct red caps, while Florentine lawyers sported ermine-trimmed robes. They shaped language too. Terms like masterpiece or journeyman slipped from workshop jargon into common speech, and their symbols became urban waypoints. Need directions in 14th century Ghent? You'd be told to turn at the cooper's barrel fountain or the goldsmith's golden tree. This cultural clout made guilds indispensable to city identity. When Bruges' cloth trade declined, its pride didn't. Locals still pointed to the ornate Guildhall carvings of sheep and looms, reminders of who'd built the city. Modern parallels hide in plain sight. Think of tech companies funding public parks or auto manufacturers sponsoring stadiums. The medium has changed, but the message remains the same. Power isn't just about production. It's about etching your name into the soul of a place. Imagine a 10-year-old boy in 15th century London, waking before sunrise to sweep wood shavings from his master's workshop. His fingers, still soft with youth, would soon grow calloused from hours of carving chests under the watchful eye of a guild-approved carpenter. This was the reality of apprenticeship, a system so rigorous it could make modern internships seem like vacations. Contracts, often signed by parents in exchange for room and board, bound children to masters for 7 years or more. The terms were brutal by today's standards. No wages, no holidays, and punishments ranging from extra chores to beatings for sloppy work. But within this crucible, something extraordinary happened. Generation after generation, hands that once fumbled with chisels learned to create furniture fit for kings. Discipline was the cornerstone. Guild statutes read like military manuals. Apprentices caught gambling faced fines. Those who wandered the streets after curfew risked imprisonment. In Florence, a young goldsmith's first lesson wasn't shaping metal, it was learning to stand perfectly still for hours, mastering posture before tools. Yet these exacting standards had a purpose. When every piece bore the guild's seal, shoddy work threatened the entire trade's reputation. A single warped barrel from a careless cooper could taint all brewers' goods. The system's genius lay in its slow burn. Skills weren't rushed, they were layered like varnish. A future silversmith might spend a year polishing unfinished pieces before ever touching an engraving tool. training his eye to spot flaws invisible to outsiders. But preservation came at a cost. Techniques guarded like state secrets sometimes vanished when masters died unexpectedly. In Nuremberg, locksmiths devised mechanisms so complex they required oral instructions never written down until plagues wiped out those who held the knowledge. Rebellions simmered beneath the surface. Journeymen in Strasbourg formed clandestine drinking societies to vent frustrations, while Lyon's silk weavers staged Europe's first recorded strikes, demanding shorter hours and fairer treatment. The most telling cracks appeared in masterpiece requirements. As guilds grew wealthier, the bar for mastership rose impossibly high. A young cabinet maker in 17th century Amsterdam might craft an exquisite marquetry desk, only to be rejected because his family lacked political connections. What's startling is how this medieval framework echoes in today's trades. Modern electricians and plumbers still climb a ladder of apprenticeships, journeyman licenses, and master exams. The difference: guilds blended education with identity. To wear a tanner's apron wasn't just a job, it was a lineage, connecting you to centuries of craftsmen who'd sworn the same oaths. That sense of belonging kept skills alive through wars and famines, ensuring a 14th century glassblower's techniques could inspire artisans in Venice today. Yet the system's greatest lesson might be its warning. When training becomes too rigid, innovation suffocates. The guilds that thrived longest balanced tradition with adaptability, like the Dresden clockmakers who embraced new gear designs while still teaching their ancestors timeless repair methods. Behind the guild hall's thick oak doors lay secrets that could make or break entire industries. Take Venice's glassmakers. Their crystalline vases and mirrors were so coveted that the Doge decreed their workshops be confined to Murano Island, with craftsmen forbidden to leave under penalty of death. This wasn't just paranoia. One defector to France in the 16th century allegedly had assassins dispatched to retrieve him, proving guild secrets were worth killing for. But their methods of protection went beyond geography. In Strasbourg, stonemasons communicated through a lexicon of coded handshakes and symbols carved discreetly into cathedrals, clues modern historians still struggle to decode. A single misplaced chisel mark might indicate which journeyman was trustworthy enough to learn advanced vaulting techniques. The most tantalizing mysteries surround what guilds actually knew. Alchemists whispered that Nuremberg's metalworkers possessed formulas to turn base metals into gold, while Persian carpet weavers supposedly embedded mathematical secrets in their patterns. Some claims were pure myth, like the rumor that English brewers could ferment beer using moonlight alone. Others held kernels of truth. Florentine painters guarded recipes for ultramarine blue pigment so closely that apprentices prepared it blindfolded, while Toledo's swordsmiths achieved such legendary flexibility in their blades that the technique died with them. This blend of fact and folklore wasn't accidental. Guilds cultivated mystique as carefully as their crafts, understanding that perceived exclusivity increased demand. Yet their greatest secret may have been how ordinary, yet ingenious their guarded knowledge truly was: the Venetian glassmaker's isolation. It prevented competitors from seeing their simple trick, adding manganese dioxide to remove impurities. The cryptic symbols of cathedral builders, mostly accounting marks tracking which apprentice carved which stone. What seemed like esoteric rituals often had practical roots. When a London blacksmith's apprentice swore an oath over an anvil, he wasn't just pledging loyalty, he was being conditioned never to reveal that quenching hot iron in urine produced a superior edge. This duality of showmanship and substance shaped guilds' enduring legacy. Their theatrical secrecy, complete with midnight initiations and blood oaths, masked systems of quality control we'd recognize today. The mystery in mystery plays performed by guilds originally referred not to the divine, but to their craft's knowledge so precious it demanded reverence. Modern patents and trade secrets are direct descendants of this mindset. The next time you see a chef guard a signature recipe or a tech company hide its algorithms, you're witnessing a tradition that began when craftsmen realized value lies not just in skill, but in the allure of the unknown. The bustling guild halls of medieval Europe weren't just the domain of men, though history books might have you think otherwise. Tucked between the lines of guild ledgers and workshop rosters are the stories of women who not only participated in these powerful organizations but sometimes outmaneuvered them entirely. Take the alewives of 14th century England, their arms elbow-deep in brewing vats, their distinctive tall hats bobbing through market squares as they sold barrels of beer. Brewing was considered women's work for centuries, partly because it could be done at home until guilds noticed its profitability and began muscling in. Some widows like Marguerite de Hainaut in Paris turned grief into opportunity. When her candlemaker husband died, she didn't just inherit his shop, she took over his guild membership, employing journeymen and training apprentices under her own name. Textiles offered another foothold. In Florence, the Silk Guild's records list dozens of women spinning gold thread, their hands moving so swiftly their work was said to resemble sunlight caught in a net. Yet their contributions were often erased by semantics. Many were classified as helpers rather than full members, paid less for the same work. Some circumvented these barriers entirely. The Beguines of the Low Countries, pious laywomen living in communal houses, ran entire weaving operations outside traditional guild control, selling their luxurious tapestries directly to nobility. Their independence was so threatening that male weavers lobbied bishops to shut them down, proof of just how disruptive women's unsupervised labor could be. Then there were the trades where women held outright dominance. Midwifery guilds, like those in 15th century Frankfurt, operated as female-led enclaves, with knowledge passed mother to daughter through whispered techniques and herb-laden remedies. Their licensing ceremonies involved swearing oaths over relics of Saint Margaret, patron of childbirth, while men, even surgeons, were barred from delivery rooms. But this autonomy came with a price. When male physicians began systematizing medicine, they painted midwives as superstitious old wives, slowly squeezing them out of legitimacy. The most fascinating cases are the rule breakers. Agnes the smith in York, who disguised herself as a man to work her forge until her strength gave her away. The unnamed weaver maids of Cologne who formed secret nighttime workshops, defying curfews made to keep them at their spinning wheels. Their stories force us to rethink guilds not as monolithic boys' clubs but as ecosystems where women found cracks and sometimes pried them wide open. The parchment might list masters as male, but the hands that dyed it, the needles that stitched its binding, often belonged to women working in history's margins. What emerges is a shadow economy of female skill, one that thrived despite guilds' best efforts to contain it. These women didn't just challenge the system, they proved it couldn't function without them. When a Strasbourg guild tried banning female embroiderers in the 15th century, the quality of ceremonial vestments plummeted so drastically the ban was repealed within a year. Their legacy lingers in today's debates about unpaid labor and glass ceilings, remind us that the fight for recognition in skilled trades isn't new, just unfinished. Guild halls weren't just workshops, they were political war rooms where the fate of cities could be decided over a tankard of ale. In 14th century Cologne, the city council wasn't dominated by nobles or bishops, but by guild masters who controlled everything from bread prices to the deployment of the town militia. These men didn't just make laws, they wore the chains of office around their necks, literally forging governance in the same fires where they hammered out horseshoes. When conflicts arose, guild leaders didn't lobby, they locked the city gates. In 1386, the Butchers' Guild of Ghent single-handedly turned the tide of a rebellion by refusing to supply meat to the Count of Flanders' troops, starving his army into submission. But with great power came brutal backlash. Kings and nobles watched guilds rise with mounting unease. In Florence, the Medici family famously manipulated wool and silk guilds to bankroll their political machine, only to dismantle their privileges once securely in power. Meanwhile, Parisian guilds walked a knife's edge. Their lavish gifts to the crown bought temporary favor. But when peasant revolts erupted in 1358, King John Roman II didn't hesitate to sacrifice them, ordering guild leaders hanged as scapegoats for high food prices. The streets ran red with more than dyed cloth during these upheavals. During the Ciompi Revolt of 1378, Florentine wool workers excluded from guild privileges burned down the homes of master weavers, screaming, "You made the gold, now eat the flames." The most fascinating battles weren't fought with swords but with ledgers. Hanseatic League merchants could cripple kingdoms by rerouting trade routes, as they did when Norwegian kings refused tax concessions. In return, monarchs played guilds against each other. Edward Roman III of England lured Flemish weavers to London with promises of guild autonomy, sparking an economic war that hollowed out Bruges workshops. Even the church got entangled. When Pope Boniface Roman VIII needed funds for his wars, he didn't request donations from guilds. He demanded them, threatening to excommunicate entire trades unless they paid up. This high-stakes chess game left lasting marks on governance. Modern corporate lobbying traces its roots to guilds' practice of gifting mayors with fine tapestries or silver cups, veiled bribes wrapped in respectability. The concept of regulatory capture, where industries control their own oversight, isn't new. It's what happened when London fishmongers wrote the laws on seafood inspections. Yet guilds also pioneered public services we now take for granted. After the Great Fire of 1339 in Strasbourg, it wasn't the nobility but the Carpenters' Guild that rebuilt the city's infrastructure, proving that political power could be measured not just in coercion but in competence. The bitter irony, many guilds became the very monopolies they'd originally formed to resist. By the 17th century, the once democratic organizations that protected craftsmen had ossified into hereditary oligarchies. When French revolutionaries stormed guild halls in 1789, they weren't just attacking symbols of privilege, they were tearing down a system that had forgotten its purpose. The lesson echoes today. Any institution that confuses guarding standards with guarding power sows the seeds of its own destruction. To kneel in a medieval chapel was to witness the guild's silent sermons in stained glass. High above the pews, sunlight streamed through panels depicting not just saints, but shoemakers at their benches, weavers at their looms, craftsmen immortalized alongside martyrs. These weren't mere decorations, they were theological statements. The glaziers who crafted them believed their trade was a form of prayer, each lead line and pigment choice a dialogue with the divine. In Chartres Cathedral, the window donated by the Drapers' Guild shows wool merchants presenting their cloth to the Virgin Mary, a bold claim that earthly work held celestial worth. This sacred professional blend shaped guild identity at every level. Take the annual feast of Saint Eligius, patron of goldsmiths, when masters paraded through Paris carrying votive crowns they'd crafted not for sale, but as offerings to Saint Chapelle. The ritual served dual purposes, displaying technical prowess while securing divine favor for the year's ventures. Even guild charters invoked heavenly authority. London's blacksmiths opened meetings by reading aloud the legend of Tubal Cain, the biblical first metalsmith, reinforcing that their hammers were extensions of sacred history. But this spiritual armor had chinks. When Reformation winds swept Europe, Protestant reformers targeted guilds as bastions of popish superstition. In Zurich, guild halls became battlegrounds as reformers smashed statues of patron saints, denouncing them as idols. The backlash wasn't just theological, it was economic. Many guilds derived income from maintaining side altars or funding masses for deceased members. When Strasbourg turned Lutheran in 1524, the Tanners Guild lost nearly a third of its revenue overnight, their once lucrative candle sales for soul prayers now deemed heretical. Yet some adapted with startling creativity. Nuremberg's locksmiths, stripped of their St. Peter imagery, rebranded their craft's precision as a Protestant virtue, divine order in every tumbler. Dutch fishmongers replaced Saint Day processions with blessings of the fleet, appeasing Calvinist elders while keeping tradition alive, the deepest irony. Many Protestant guilds eventually developed their own quasi-religious rituals, like the Danish printer's custom of inking Bibles on Gutenberg's birthday. What endured was the notion that skilled labor carried transcendent meaning. Whether carving a saint's likeness or a simple chair leg, guilds taught that human hands could echo divine creation. Today's craft revival movements, from artisanal bakeries to bespoke woodworking, unwittingly channel this same hunger, the desire to make work more than wage labor, to infuse sweat with sacrament. When you see a modern potter sign her creations with a mark as deliberate as any guild seal, she's inheriting an 8th-century-old belief that craftsmanship, at its best, brushes against the eternal. The reach of guilds stretched far beyond city walls, their influence woven into a vast, invisible web connecting workshops from Lisbon to Novgorod. At the heart of this medieval globalization stood the Hanseatic League, a super alliance of merchant guilds that turned the Baltic into their private trading pond. Picture a fleet of cog ships, each bearing the distinctive red and white pennants of Hanseatic ports, crisscrossing icy waters to deliver Russian furs to London and Flemish wool to Riga. But this wasn't just about moving goods, it was about moving knowledge. A stonemason in Lübeck could perfect a new vaulting technique, and within years it would appear in Stockholm's cathedrals, carried not by nobles or scholars, but by guild journeymen swapping secrets over ale in foreign harbors. What made these networks revolutionary was their ability to bypass kingdoms entirely. When the King of Denmark tried to tax Hanseatic ships too heavily in 1368, the League didn't protest. They blockaded his ports for over a decade, starving his treasury until he capitulated. Their power lay in unity. If one Hanse city faced piracy, a dozen others would suspend trade with the offender's homeland until reparations were paid. This collective muscle birthed innovations we now take for granted. The Hanseatic pound, a standardized weight adopted across 70 cities, foreshadowed modern trade agreements, while their system of warehouse hubs called contours inspired today's free trade zones. Yet the League was just the most famous thread in a sprawling tapestry of connections. Venetian glassmakers taught their techniques to Saxon craftsmen in hidden forest workshops, while Persian rug weaving patterns traveled through guild-protected channels to appear in Spanish synagogues. Even conflict spread skills. When the 100 Years' War disrupted French paper production, guild-trained workers fled to Germany, transforming Mainz into Europe's new paper capital. The most surprising part, many guilds actively encouraged this cross-pollination. Strasbourg's stonemasons required journeymen to travel to at least 3 foreign cities before qualifying as masters, ensuring no single workshop hoarded expertise. These networks also became early incubators for intellectual property. The famed watermark mystery of 15th-century papermakers shows how guilds protected secrets across borders. By embedding unique wire patterns into paper sheets visible only when held to light, they could trace counterfeiters from Burgundy to Bologna. Similarly, Florentine silk guilds distributed coded dye recipes to trusted affiliates, with errors deliberately inserted to catch plagiarists. This wasn't just about profit, it was about preserving reputations in an era where a shoddy bolt of cloth sold under a guild's name in Gdansk could ruin its standing in Genoa. The legacy of these alliances lingers in unexpected places. Modern franchise models echo the Hanseatic system of standardized quality controls, while artisan collectives from Kyoto's pottery districts to Detroit's craft breweries still rely on guild-style knowledge sharing. Perhaps their greatest lesson was proving that trust could stretch across continents long before passports or the internet, that a handshake between two goldsmiths in Prague and Palermo could carry more weight than a king's decree. When we marvel at how Gothic arches spread from Paris to Prague with near-identical precision, we're witnessing the quiet triumph of these medieval internationalists, masters of trade who turned entire continents into their workshops. By the early 1700s, the once mighty guild system stood at a crossroads, its foundations cracking under the weight of revolutions both industrial and intellectual. The clatter of mechanized looms in Manchester's new factories drowned out the rhythmic tapping of handlooms in guild workshops, while Enlightenment philosophers like Voltaire mocked guilds as relics of a superstitious age. Yet their unraveling wasn't swift or uniform. In Paris, the wigmakers' guild still paraded through streets with powdered curls piled high, oblivious that their trade would vanish within decades. Meanwhile, German cutlers in Solingen quietly partnered with factory owners, trading guild halls for steam-powered grinding wheels. This uneven decline reveals a truth: guilds didn't collapse. They were chiseled away piece by forces they couldn't control. The first blow came from technology. When James Watt's steam engine began powering textile mills, the centuries-old equation of skill equaling value shattered. A single machine operated by unapprenticed laborers could produce more cloth in a day than a master weaver's entire workshop. Guilds responded with desperate measures. The London framework knitters sabotaged mechanical looms under cover of night, while Lyon's silk weavers petitioned the king to ban Jacquard's revolutionary punch card system, failing to realize these innovations couldn't be uninvented. Only the shrewdest adapted. Birmingham's Metalworkers Guild, rather than resisting industrialization, became early investors in Bolton and Watt's engine factory, trading craft monopolies for dividend checks. Political wins proved equally destructive. Enlightenment thinkers painted guilds as enemies of progress, their strict hierarchies clashing with new ideals of free trade and meritocracy. Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations delivered a brutal assessment. Guilds consumed the vigor of industry in the womb. Rulers took note. When Joseph Roman II of Austria dissolved Vienna's guilds in 1789, he didn't just revoke their charters. He melted down their ceremonial silver and auctioned their relics as symbols of broken tyranny. Even Napoleon, though he temporarily revived some French guilds as propaganda tools, stripped them of real power, turning them into hollow professional societies. Yet some clung to relevance through sheer cultural inertia. In Florence, the Wool Guild still inspected cloth with medieval fervor as late as 1830. Never mind that their city's textile industry had collapsed decades earlier. The real death knell came from capitalism itself. As railroads and telegraphs shrank distances, local monopolies became impossible to enforce. Why pay a guild master's premium for a Dresden cabinetmaker's work when cheaper, factory-made alternatives arrived by rail from Berlin? Final indignity came when governments repurposed guild halls. The once feared Butchers' Guild of Ghent became a municipal meat inspection office, its blood-stained ledgers replaced by bureaucratic forms. What's haunting is how many modern struggles mirror these death throes. The debates over automation displacing workers, guilds faced it first, the tension between artisan quality and mass production. They lived it. Even today's gig economy echoes their twilight platform. Algorithms now dictate standards once set by guild wardens. The difference, guilds at least offered community in exchange for control. When a 19th century watchmakers guild disbanded, its members lost more than income. They lost pensions, funeral funds, the very structure that gave their labor meaning. That loss lingers in our collective memory, a ghostly reminder that progress always exacts a human price. The clash between guilds and early capitalism wasn't just an economic shift, it was a philosophical earthquake. Picture Adam Smith in 1776, quill in hand, drafting the wealth of nations as guilds across Europe still dictated the number of nails a blacksmith could produce in a week. His famous condemnation that guilds restrain competition struck at their core. But this wasn't merely a battle between old and new, it was a collision of two visions for society. Guilds had spent centuries perfecting a world where quality trumped quantity, where a master's reputation mattered more than his output. Capitalism, with its faceless markets and relentless efficiency, asked a radical question: what if abundance mattered more than perfection? The friction erupted in unexpected ways. In 18th century Birmingham, metalworkers' guilds fought tooth and nail against factory owners who hired unapprenticed laborers to mass-produce buttons and buckles. The guilds saw this as sacrilege, their sacred craft reduced to mindless repetition. Yet the factories had logic on their side. Why should a child spend 7 years apprenticing to make a single perfect hinge when machines could produce 100 serviceable ones in an hour? This tension exposed guilds' Achilles' heel. Their meticulous standards, once a shield against shoddy work, now felt like anchors in a world racing toward industrialization. But capitalism's triumph wasn't as clean as textbooks suggest. Guilds had been more than just monopolies. They'd been social safety nets. When Manchester's cotton mills began luring weavers away from guild workshops with higher wages, workers soon discovered the dark trade-off. A guild journeyman injured on the job could count on his fraternity for medical care, while a factory hand crippled by unguarded machinery was tossed onto the street. The very regulations Smith ridiculed like limits on work hours had prevented the brutal exploitation that would later fuel labor movements. This duality plays out in modern parallels. Think of today's gig economy, where platforms promise freedom but often strip workers of protections guilds once guaranteed. Or consider artisanal cheesemakers battling industrial dairy conglomerates, echoes of medieval bakers fighting to keep cheap flour out of their loaves. The deepest irony, many industries now pay consultants to recreate what guilds did organically. Mentorship programs mimicking apprenticeships, quality certifications replacing guild seals, even corporate retreats that faintly resemble guild feasts. The real lesson lies in what was lost in the transition. Guilds didn't just regulate, they instilled pride. A Strasbourg stonemason didn't just carve blocks, he knew his work would outlive him, bearing his mark for generations. Capitalism's great innovation was divorcing labor from identity, turning craftsmanship into a commodity. Yet centuries later, as workers grapple with burnout and meaningless jobs, the guild's vision of work as vocation, not just transaction, feels newly relevant. The debate was never simply about efficiency versus tradition. It was about whether a society values what things cost or what they truly mean. Walk through Florence's Uffizi Gallery today, and you're not just seeing Renaissance brilliance, you're stepping inside a guild hall's wildest dream. Those luminous altarpieces, those impossibly lifelike sculptures, they weren't just born from individual genius, they were bankrolled by the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers of medieval Europe. When the Wool Merchants Guild commissioned Donatello's St. George, they weren't just buying art, they were buying immortality, stamping their trade's insignia beside the saint's armored feet. This was patronage with a twist. Guilds didn't merely fund artists, they shaped entire movements by demanding religious scenes be woven with threads of everyday labor. The Ghent altarpiece's lamb, painted with such anatomical precision, that's a butcher's guild member peering over Van Eyck's shoulder, insisting the fleece looked touchably real. The training of artists like Michelangelo reveals the guild system's hidden curriculum. At 14, he wasn't handed a chisel and set loose. He was apprenticed to Ghirlandaio's workshop, a guild-sanctioned atelier, where he ground pigments for years before sketching a single figure. This grueling initiation wasn't hazing, it was a deliberate philosophy. Guilds believed mastery flowed upward from mundane tasks, that polishing marble dust would teach a sculptor about light, that stirring vats of linseed oil would train a painter's eye for viscosity. The proof lies in the details of Renaissance art, the way a drapery folds with cloth merchant accuracy in a Botticelli, or how a Caravaggio still life's grapes glisten with vintner-approved dew. These weren't happy accidents, they were guild education made visible. Guild commissions also smuggled subversive ideas into sacred spaces. In Siena's cathedral, the floor mosaics funded by the Wool Guild don't just depict biblical scenes, they show sheep shearing and loom work, elevating textile labor to the level of scripture. Venice's glassmakers went further, insisting their donated chalices contain cobalt only they could import, turning communion cups into advertisements for Murano's monopoly. Even the pigments tell stories. Lapis lazuli blue, more expensive than gold, appears disproportionately in guild-sponsored works because these patrons understood something modern marketers grasp today. Conspicuous quality builds brand recognition across centuries. The system's true innovation was its meritocratic loophole. While nobility collected art as status symbols, guilds treated talent as currency. A young Leonardo da Vinci, born illegitimate and thus barred from most professions, found his path through the Florence Painters Guild. The contract for his adoration of the Magi preserved in the Guild archives shows something revolutionary: payments tied to milestone approvals, a 15th-century version of modern creative retainers. This structured support allowed artists to take risks. Without the stability of guild contracts, would Brunelleschi have dared design his impossible dome? Or would Ghiberti have spent 27 years perfecting the baptistery doors? Yet the guild's greatest artistic legacy might be what they destroyed to create. To gild a frame, they melted down ancient Roman coins. To make vibrant reds, they pulverized mummies looted from Egyptian tombs. This wasn't vandalism, it was alchemy, transforming the past into new visions. When Napoleon later looted guild altarpieces for French museums, he completed a cycle the guilds themselves had begun. Art as both treasure and trophy, forever caught between preservation and reinvention. The next time you admire a Renaissance masterpiece, look past the brushstrokes to the guild marks hidden in corner shadows, the quiet signatures of the butchers, bakers, and bankers who gambled that funding beauty was the surest path to eternity. Guild halls weren't just workplaces, they were stone and timber manifestos declaring a trade's importance to the world. Take London's Fishmongers' Hall, its riverfront facade carved with leaping salmon, and oysters so lifelike you'd swear you smelled the sea. Or Bruges' Porterslag, where the Brokers' Guild perched a golden bear atop their tower, a cheeky challenge to rival cities. Our wealth literally outshines yours. These buildings spoke a visual language every medieval citizen understood. A butcher's guild hall flaunted ruby red bricks symbolizing blood and vitality, while a goldsmith's boasted windows wide enough to flood worktables with light proof they had nothing to hide. The message was clear: craftsmanship deserved palaces too. The true marvels lay in the details ordinary citizens never saw. Beneath Ghent's linen weavers' guild hall, archaeologists found a network of lead pipes supplying dye vats with filtered rainwater, a hydraulic system centuries ahead of its time. In Augsburg, the cooper's meeting chamber featured a barrel-vaulted ceiling with acoustic tricks whisper a secret at one end, and only the master's chair could hear it. Even the floors told stories. Excavations in York revealed Guildhall flagstones worn into grooves by generations of cobblers dragging their stools to the same spot each morning, their daily rhythms etched into stone. What's astonishing is how many survived Europe's turbulent history. Florence's Orson Michel began as a grain market, transformed by guilds into a jewel box of niches, each statue commissioned by a different trade. The cloth seller's St. Mark glowers beside the sword maker's St. George, their stone faces frozen in eternal competition. Some guild halls adapted with dark pragmatism. When Antwerp's merchants needed more space, they simply commandeered a Gothic chapel, painting over saints' frescoes with ledger books and ship inventories. Today, these buildings whisper secrets to those who know how to look. Copenhagen's Brewers Guildhall, now a boutique hotel, still bears charm marks from the Great Fire of 1728, and if you peek behind the front desk, there's a 14th century malt grinding wheel repurposed as decor. In Strasbourg, what was once the tanner's foul-smelling headquarters now houses the European Parliament, its walls still pocked with hooks where hides once dried. The ultimate irony, London's Skinner's Hall, where Tudor-era fur traders plotted monopolies, today hosts climate change conferences beneath its original oak beams. These structures remind us that guilds weren't abstract concepts, they were physical forces shaping cities. Every ornate gable, every stained glass window depicting a guild's patron saint, was a calculated display meant to awe customers and intimidate rivals. When you walk past a former guild hall turned cafe or museum, you're not just seeing repurposed real estate, you're glimpsing the DNA of modern commerce, where branding and craftsmanship once mingled under roofs built to last 1,000 years. The stones themselves seem to murmur, quality isn't just made, it's monumentally enshrined. Beneath the guild's polished veneer of brotherly oaths and quality seals lurked a shadow economy of backroom deals and strong-arm tactics. Take the London fishmongers in 1349, caught red-handed buying up entire boatloads of herring before they reached market, then selling the rotting surplus to monasteries at triple the price. When city officials investigated, they found guild ledgers with coded entries coins paid to St. Peter's Arms, actually lining the pockets of corrupt bailiffs. This wasn't an isolated case. In 15th century Frankfurt, the Bakers' Guild was caught adding ground chalk to flour, while Parisian candle makers diluted their wax with animal fat, pocketing the difference. The very organizations sworn to uphold standards sometimes became their greatest violators. The most brazen abuses unfolded in plain sight. Venetian glassmakers, already enjoying a state-enforced monopoly, took to sabotaging competitors' shipments. Historian records describe mysterious fires at rival warehouses. Cologne's wool guilds operated a medieval price-fixing scheme, threatening merchants who undercut their rates with arson or broken kneecaps. Even religious piety became a weapon. When a Nuremberg locksmith dared sell his wares outside guild channels, his workshop was vandalized with symbols condemning him as a thief from Judah's line. The irony, many guilds had originally formed to combat exactly this kind of exploitation by feudal lords. Power bred arrogance. By the 1600s, some guilds functioned more like criminal syndicates than professional bodies. Strasbourg's Tanners' Guild demanded apprenticeship fees so exorbitant they equaled a commoner's lifetime earnings, payable in secret midnight meetings with armed guards at the door. In Lyon, silk masters kept journeymen in perpetual debt by controlling access to raw materials, a practice so notorious it inspired early labor protests. The backlash wasn't just economic, it was spiritual. When Reformation preachers railed against the greed of gilded men, they tapped into widespread fury over artisans who'd forgotten their sacred duty to fair dealing. Yet the darkest chapters involved collusion with political elites. Genoa's Spice Guild maintained a secret ledger tracking bribes to customs officials. One page lists a payment to silence the harbor master's inconvenient conscience. In Amsterdam, diamond cutters' guild leaders were caught selling masterships to nobles' incompetent sons, eroding craftsmanship until Dutch gems lost their premium. Even the Hanseatic League, once a model of merchant integrity, decayed into a racket where officials took kickbacks for looking the other way as substandard goods flooded the market. What makes these betrayals sting isn't just the hypocrisy, it's how they weaponized trust. Guild seals were meant to guarantee quality, but counterfeit marks began appearing on shoddy goods. The system's greatest strength, its tight-knit bonds, became its fatal flaw, creating insular cultures where corruption festered unchecked. When French revolutionaries stormed guild halls in 1789, they weren't just attacking privilege, they were destroying symbols of broken promises. Modern parallels abound, from cartel-like tech monopolies to unions embroiled in embezzlement scandals. The guild's legacy warns us, any institution that polices itself eventually faces the same choice: reform or revolt. Perhaps their most enduring lesson lies in the backlash they provoked. The same Londoners who once cheered fishmongers for feeding the poor later pelted their guild hall with rotten fish during price riots. This pendulum swing from reverence to rage mirrors our own era's distrust of powerful institutions. The guilds didn't just fail because machines replaced hands, they fell because they forgot their sacred compact with the communities they served. When craftsmanship becomes a club rather than a calling, even the grandest guild hall's foundations will crack. When Geoffrey Chaucer penned the Canterbury Tales in the late 14th century, he didn't just capture pilgrims' voices, he immortalized the guilds that shaped their world. The weaver, the dyer, the haberdasher, each character strides onto the page with their trade's pride and prejudices intact, their stories steeped in the same rivalries and rituals that filled actual guild halls. Chaucer's Miller, with his thumb perpetually on the scale, isn't just a comic figure, he's a satire of guild inspectors who turned blind eyes for bribes. These tales reveal a society deeply ambivalent about the system that governed its livelihoods, celebrating craftsmanship while skewering the hypocrisy of masters who preached fairness but practiced favoritism. Folk tales amplified this tension. German Meisterlieder master songs spun yarns of apprentices outwitting cruel masters through wit rather than skill, a fantasy that resonated in workshops where promotion often depended on connections, not merit. One popular story tells of a shoemaker's apprentice who solves an impossible riddle by noticing his master's daughter mouthing the answer, exposing how guild nepotism could trump talent. Even fairy tales got in on the critique. The original Rumpelstiltskin wasn't just about spinning straw into gold. It mirrored actual guild disputes over who truly owned a craftsman's output when materials were provided by wealthy patrons. Yet these stories also preserved vanishing worlds. When the Grimm brothers collected the shoemaker and the elves, they unknowingly documented guild-era shoe sizing systems, elves leaving finished pairs on lasts, the wooden foot molds that were trade secrets. Similarly, Chaucer's description of the cook's mormel A festering sore hints at guild health inspections where visible ailments could cost a man his license. The most revealing details often hide in throwaway lines. A 15th century Swiss play mocking greedy coopers mentions barrels, hooped with stolen iron, a sly nod to real guild penalties for purloined materials. Legends also kept guild mysticism alive. Scandinavian tales spoke of blacksmiths forging living metal that sang when struck, a poetic echo of master bladesmiths' guarded quenching techniques. In Provence, stories circulated about masons who could make stone float, likely inspired by guild architects' ingenious pulley systems. These weren't just tall tales, they were oral archives of techniques too valuable to write down. When a Welsh folktale describes a weaver's daughter recreating a tapestry from a single thread, it mirrors how guilds taught pattern making through painstaking repetition rather than written instructions. The darkest narratives exposed guilds' underbellies. Dutch Clutchen comic plays featured drunken guildmasters auctioning off apprenticeships to the highest bidder, while Italian carnival songs mocked goldsmiths for alloying sacred votive offerings with cheap copper. Even Shakespeare got in on the act. The Taming of the Shrews. Christopher Sly, a drunken tinker, reflects the low status of itinerant smiths outside formal guild structures. These portrayals weren't mere entertainment, they were social pressure valves, allowing commoners to laugh at institutions that held real power over their lives. What makes these literary ghosts so haunting is how they refract through modern culture. The trope of the plucky apprentice, from Star Wars' Luke Skywalker to the legend of Korra's metalbenders, still carries guild-era echoes of skill triumphing over entrenched hierarchy. Next time you hear a fantasy novel's Thieves' Guild or play Assassin's Creed's Artisan Quests, you're walking paths laid by medieval storytellers who understood one enduring truth. Behind every trade's polished facade, there's always a backroom and a backstory. Across the Silk Roads and spice routes, guild-like systems emerged in civilizations that never exchanged a single word. In Kyoto's shadowed workshops, Japan's Zo craftsmen practiced arts passed father to son under shogunate protection, while in Delhi's bustling bazaars, Shreni merchants organized entire neighborhoods by trade. What's striking isn't their differences, it's how these distant cultures arrived at nearly identical solutions to universal problems. Take quality control. Where Florentine wool guilds stamped their cloth with seals, Javanese batik guilds used proprietary wax-resist patterns as trademarks, and Persian carpet weavers wove hidden signatures into their knots. Each system developed independently, yet all recognized that trust required visible proof. The Tsar of feudal Japan took heredity further than any European counterpart. A swordsmith's lineage wasn't just prestigious, it was law. The Gasson school, tracing its techniques to the 12th century, still produces blades today using methods so guarded that apprentices marry into the family rather than train externally. Contrast this with Istanbul's Asnaf, where the Grand Bazaar's guilds answered directly to the Sultan's market inspectors. Turkish coffee brewers didn't just set standards, their guild chief held judicial power, settling disputes between vendors with the finality of a judge's gavel. Where European guilds jockeyed for civic power, Ottoman craftsmen became extensions of state authority, their workshops doubling as tax collection points. India's Shreni carved a middle path. Ancient texts like the Artha Shastra describe these groups as part trade association, part caste, and part banking system. A bronze caster's Shreni in Mohenjo-Daro might fund temple construction, while also regulating alloy formulas so precisely that Delhi's rust-resistant iron pillars still baffle metallurgists. Their most ingenious innovation, the Hundi System Guild, issued promissory notes that functioned as medieval travelers' checks, accepted from Baghdad to Angkor Wat based purely on collective trust. Religious ties also diverged dramatically. European guilds plastered saints on every altar, but Islamic Asnaf grounded their authority in Hisba, the Quranic duty to command good and forbid wrongdoing in commerce. A Damascus sword makers guild didn't just test blades for sharpness, they ensured transactions adhered to Sharia law, with fines calculated in silver dinars or sacks of wheat for the poor. Meanwhile, Japan's Tsar often answered to Buddhist monasteries, with sake brewers and papermakers donating portions of their output to temples in exchange for divine favor and tax exemptions. The death knell for these systems came from opposite directions. Europe's guilds crumbled under industrialization's steam-powered wheels, while Japan's Tsar were dismantled by Meiji reformers eager to modernize. Yet their ghosts linger. Kyoto's Nishijin textile district still operates on Tsar-era zoning, and Istanbul's Grand Bazaar vendors invoke Asnaf traditions when boycotting unfair suppliers. Perhaps the most poignant survival is India's Daskar cooperatives, where handloom weavers use Shreni-style profit sharing to compete with factories, proving that some solutions transcend time and technology. These parallel systems remind us that before globalization, before mass production, humanity had already discovered a profound truth. Craftsmanship thrives not in isolation, but in community. Guild workshops weren't just places of manual labor, they were clandestine laboratories where the foundations of modern science quietly took shape. Consider the goldsmiths of medieval Nuremberg, hunched over their crucibles not just to craft jewelry, but to unravel the secrets of matter itself. Their meticulous records of alloy compositions and reactions became Europe's first chemistry textbooks, though they'd never call it that. When a master discovered that adding antimony to molten gold produced a startlingly clear mirror-like finish, he wasn't just perfecting his craft, he was laying groundwork for optical science. These artisans thought in equations long before they could write them, measuring the world in practical terms. How much heat to bend iron without cracking it, how finely to grind lapis lazuli to achieve the perfect blue. Shipwrights' guilds pushed boundaries even further. The same Hamburg craftsmen who built Hanseatic trading cogs developed early sextants by modifying their carpentry tools, marking angles on their compasses with the same precision they used to dovetail hull planks. Their innovations didn't stay in harbor workshops. When Vasco da Gama rounded the Cape of Good Hope, his navigational charts bore symbols copied directly from Baltic guild manuals. The irony, many of these advances were accidental byproducts of solving mundane problems. A Venetian glassmaker trying to eliminate bubbles from goblets stumbled upon principles of gas solubility that later informed Robert Boyle's experiments. The most surprising collaborations unfolded in textile centers. Florence's wool guilds kept detailed climate records not out of scholarly interest, but to predict how humidity would affect dye absorption. Centuries later, meteorologists realized these guild ledgers contained the most accurate medieval weather data in existence. Similarly, the silk weavers of Lyon documented hundreds of plant-based dyes so meticulously that their color fastness trials became foundational texts for organic chemistry. What guilds lacked in theoretical frameworks, they made up for in relentless empirical testing. A master tanner might not understand why oak bark tannins preserved leather, but he could recite 20 generations worth of exact soaking times that worked. This practical genius extended to medicine. Apothecaries' guilds in Salerno and Montpellier maintained herb gardens with meticulous labeling systems that predated Linnaean taxonomy. Their recipe books, part trade secret, part medical text, reveal astonishing proto-scientific thinking. A 15th century Venetian formula for pain relief calls for willow bark extract steeped in alcohol at precisely 45 degrees, unwittingly synthesizing aspirin's active ingredient. Guilds became early adopters of peer review too. Before publishing a new technique, master founders would invite rivals to test their bronze casting methods, creating a brutal but effective quality control system. The true measure of their scientific impact lies in the tools they left behind. The astrolabes crafted by Toledo's metalworkers guided explorers across oceans. The precision scales developed by Augsburg's gold weighers enabled Lavoisier's groundbreaking measurements. Even the humble alembic, a guild glassblower's distillation device, became the emblem of alchemy's transformation into chemistry. These craftsmen didn't see themselves as revolutionaries. They were simply solving Monday's problems with Wednesday's ingenuity. Yet their workshop benches became the forgotten forges where the medieval mind first hammered out the shape of things to come. By the mid-19th century, as factories belched smoke over Manchester and standardized goods flooded markets, a strange thing happened. People began longing for the world guilds had built. The arts and crafts movement, spearheaded by visionaries like William Morris, didn't just admire medieval craftsmanship, they weaponized nostalgia. Morris's Red House, with its hand-carved furniture and stained glass windows, was a direct rebuke to industrial shoddiness, a deliberate echo of guild workshops where beauty and utility intertwined. This wasn't mere aesthetics, it was ideology. When Morris declared, "Have nothing in your houses that you do not know to be useful or believe to be beautiful," he was channeling guild ethos, the belief that objects should carry the soul of their maker. Yet these revivalists faced a paradox. They celebrated guilds' communal spirit while rejecting their monopolistic tendencies. The Century Guild, founded in 1882, mimicked medieval structures with apprenticeships and master craftsmen, but championed artistic freedom over rigid hierarchies. Their exhibitions showcasing hand-printed books and wrought iron gates were less about commerce than crusades, proving that mass production hadn't wholly extinguished the human touch. The irony, many of these groups relied on wealthy patrons, a far cry from guild self-sufficient brotherhoods. Today's artisan cooperatives carry the torch with modern twists. In Portland, Oregon, the Guild of Oregon Woodworkers runs a shared workshop where members pay sliding scale dues based on income, echoing guilds' tiered membership but ditching exclusionary practices. Barcelona's textile collective Les Tisserands goes further, blending medieval weaving techniques with open-source patterns, their looms humming in a repurposed chapel as if to sanctify the revival. What unites these movements isn't just technique, it's a shared rage against the disposable. When a Brooklyn ceramicist stamps her pots with a guild-inspired mark, she's not selling nostalgia, she's declaring that some things should last longer than a TikTok trend. The most compelling adaptations address guilds' original sins. Germany's Bauhütten, modern descendants of cathedral builder guilds, train stonemasons using centuries-old methods but welcome women and immigrants groups medieval guilds often barred. Similarly, Japan's contemporary Za-style groups, like Kyoto's Kanami Tsuji metalworkers, preserve traditions without hereditary gatekeeping, proving that craftsmanship can evolve without eroding its soul. Even the digital realm gets inventive. Online platforms like Fairmark function as virtual guild halls, connecting ethical makers directly to buyers, cutting out exploitative middlemen just as medieval guilds once fought off predatory merchants. What these revivals reveal is timeless, not a yearning for the past, but for the values guilds embodied at their best. When a Detroit blacksmith collective sets up shop in a bankrupt factory, or French bakers revolt against industrial flour, they're fighting the same battles guilds once did, for dignity in labor, for the right to make things well rather than cheaply. The difference: today's artisans wield Instagram alongside chisels, turning what was once local into global resistance. The guilds may be gone, but their creed endures wherever hands shape raw materials with care, and communities remember that some things lose meaning when made without love. Guilds have slithered from medieval ledgers into the glowing screens of modern entertainment, their mystique undimmed by centuries. In Game of Thrones, the Alchemist's Guild of King's Landing isn't just a backdrop. It's a shadowy powerhouse hoarding wildfire recipes like Venetian glassmakers guarded their crystal techniques. The show's depiction of guilds as both protectors and parasites mirrors historical reality, noble when upholding standards, ruthless when defending monopolies. Even the fictional Faceless Men, with their lethal apprenticeships and initiation trials, echo the clandestine rituals of real-life masonry guilds that swore members to secrecy under pain of death. Video games amplify this duality. The Elder Scrolls series lets players join the Thieves' Guild or Dark Brotherhood, organizations that feel authentically medieval despite their supernatural twists. Their tiered ranks apprentice, journeyman, master are ripped straight from guild charters right down to the masterpiece quests that gatekeep advancement. Even the crafting systems in games like World of Warcraft unconsciously replicate guild economics. Specialized trainers, rare recipe drops, and faction reputations mirror how historical guilds controlled knowledge through scarcity. The irony: while players chafe at these artificial barriers, their ancestors faced far harsher versions. Imagine losing your real livelihood because you couldn't craft a virtual legendary sword. Fantasy literature takes the romanticism further. Terry Pratchett's Discworld novels feature guilds so vividly absurd, from the Assassin's Guild's etiquette classes to the Clown's Guild's deadly pie fights, that they expose the inherent silliness of real guild excesses. Yet beneath the satire lies truth. Ankh-Morpork's Seamstress's Guild Wink parallels how actual medieval cities regulated sex work through guild-like structures. Even Harry Potter's Wizarding World borrows guild tropes, the precise specialization of Diagon Alley shops, the way Ollivander's guards wandlore like Nuremberg's locksmiths hid their mechanisms. What makes these portrayals compelling isn't their historical accuracy, it's how they repurpose guilds' dramatic potential. A Witcher contract board operates like a guild job ledger, filtering work through trusted intermediaries. Assassin's Creed's artisan missions reveal how guilds anchored communities, while Greedfall's faction system shows their political clout, the best part. These fictions spark curiosity. When players Google medieval guilds after encountering them in Kingdom Come: Deliverance, they're stepping into a rabbit hole that leads straight to the Florentine wool trade or Hanseatic League. Yet pop culture often misses guilds' most revolutionary aspect: their role as early meritocracies. For every fantasy trope of guilds as corrupt bureaucracies, dishonored overseers, history offers counterexamples like the illiterate apprentices who rose to mayoralty through craft. Modern storytelling favors intrigue over nuanced guildmasters are more likely to be villains in Dragon Age than complex figures like the real-life Marguerite de Hainaut, who turned her late husband's candle-making guild into a female-led empire. The next time you encounter a fictional guild, listen for the whispers of history beneath the scripted drama, the echoes of a system where skill and solidarity once forged kingdoms. The rhythmic clack of a keyboard in a 21st century coworking space seems worlds apart from the hammer strikes of a medieval blacksmith's forge, yet the struggles binding them are startlingly similar. Today's gig workers, shuffling between app-based hustles without healthcare or pensions, face a dislocation guilds were designed to prevent: a lack of belonging, of collective bargaining power, of pathways to mastery. The irony: while technology disrupted the guild model, it's also resurrecting its ethos in unexpected ways. Platforms like Patreon and Etsy function as digital guild halls, where creators pool resources for health insurance or share anti-piracy tactics, echoing how silk weavers once banded together against counterfeiters. The difference is scale. Where a Florentine wool guild could dictate citywide wages, a modern freelancers' union battles algorithms that slash pay with a single update. Some labor activists see guilds' apprenticeship systems as a blueprint for upskilling in the automation age. Germany's dual education system, where students split time between classrooms and paid workshops, directly descends from guild training models, and now boasts youth unemployment rates half those of countries with looser vocational ties. In Brooklyn, a cooperative of immigrant tailors has revived the masterpiece concept, requiring members to submit a garment judged by peers before earning full benefits. It's not about gatekeeping, explains founder Luisa Mendez. It's about ensuring no fast fashion contractor can undercut us by calling a rushed stitch good enough. Yet critics warn against romanticizing guilds' exclusionary shadows. When Barcelona's bicycle couriers formed a collective with tiered membership, accusations of favoritism erupted, mirroring medieval complaints that guilds reserved opportunities for insiders. The tension lies in balancing quality control with accessibility. Medieval goldsmiths could afford 7-year apprenticeships because their trade rarely changed. How does that translate to a software field where languages evolve every 18 months? Some neo-guild experiments strike compromises. The Freelancers Union's benefits model offers portable healthcare across gigs without demanding exclusivity, while Portugal's green receipt system gives independent workers guild-like tax breaks without rigid hierarchies. The most promising hybrids merge old wisdom with new flexibility. Amsterdam's Coders Guild, yes, they call it, that maintains open-source skill repositories like medieval craft manuals, but updates them through hackathons rather than secretive master-apprentice chains. In Seoul, delivery drivers use guild-style strike funds crowdfunded through apps to protest unsafe working conditions, proving collective action doesn't require a physical guild hall. Even corporations are borrowing elements. Salesforce's Trailhead certification badges function like digital guild marks, signaling proven skills in a chaotic job market. What guilds understood, and what our fragmented labor landscape often forgets, is that craftsmanship thrives within structure. Their true legacy isn't in recreating 14th-century hierarchies, but in reimagining how communities can uphold standards while nurturing adaptability. When a Ubersmith in Nairobi trains newcomers using YouTube tutorials modeled after guild workshops, or when a Portland ceramicist sells wares stamped with a collective mark guaranteeing living wage production, they're threading needles first spun in medieval market squares. The challenge isn't reviving guilds verbatim, but distilling their best principles. That skill deserves protection, that labor isn't just transactional, and that no worker should stand alone against the storms of change. Long before shipping containers and fiber optic cables shrank the world, guilds were already wrestling with the paradox of globalization, how to preserve hard-won local traditions while tapping into distant opportunities. Picture a Hanseatic merchant in 14th century Riga, haggling over Flemish wool that had traveled farther than most peasants ever would. His ledger might list transactions in a dozen currencies, his warehouse stocked with spices from lands whose names his grandfather couldn't pronounce. Yet for all this reach, his identity remained fiercely rooted in his guild's hometown, its crest stitched into his tunic like a medieval barcode. This tension between the local and the global wasn't just logistical, it was existential. Guilds survived by becoming early experts in globalization, a term we think of as modern, but one they practiced centuries before it was coined. The Hanseatic League's trade networks offer a masterclass in pre-industrial globalization. Their contours trading posts from London to Novgorod functioned like medieval versions of Amazon fulfillment centers, standardizing everything from barrel sizes to dispute resolution. A merchant in Bruges could sell linen to a Russian buyer with confidence, knowing the League's seals guaranteed quality across 4,000 miles, but their real innovation was cultural flexibility. When trading with Novgorod, Hanseatic merchants adopted Slavic-style fur-trimmed robes for negotiations. In Bergen, they built warehouses with distinct German gables but used local timber. This wasn't just politeness, it was branding, signaling respect while maintaining their commercial identity. Yet globalization also bred vulnerabilities. When Venetian glassmakers lost their monopoly after Marco Polo's travels revealed Asian competitors, they pivoted by marketing their wares as authentically European, playing on emerging nationalist sentiments. Similarly, Damascus steelmakers faced crisis when Indian wood steel flooded markets, forcing them to innovate with new alloy blends. The lesson: guilds that thrived weren't those that resisted change, but those that absorbed outside influences while amplifying what made them irreplaceable. Modern parallels abound. Artisan cheesemakers in Normandy now use EU subsidies to compete with industrial dairies, much like medieval guilds leveraged royal charters against foreign imports. Silicon Valley's tech guilds, from open-source collectives to patent pools, echo the way medieval craftsmen shared just enough knowledge to grow the pie while guarding core secrets. Even today's gig workers face guild-like dilemmas: how to maintain unique skills in a marketplace where algorithms flatten differentiation. The most poignant resonance lies in labor mobility. Just as journeymen carried techniques across borders, today's migrant workers transmit skills, whether Filipino nurses in Berlin or Indian programmers in Silicon Valley. Both systems rely on portable credentials, whether a medieval guild's letter of passage or a modern professional license. The difference: guilds provided structured pathways for integration, whereas today's workers often navigate global markets alone. Perhaps guilds' most valuable legacy is their proof that hyper-specialization can thrive in interconnected worlds. Murano's glassmakers didn't survive by mimicking everyone else. They doubled down on techniques so distinctive that distance became their ally. In an age where AI threatens to homogenize creativity, their example whispers an alternative. The future belongs not to those who chase global averages, but to those who cultivate irreplicable local genius. The real magic lies in doing what only you can do, then teaching the world to value it. Buried beneath layers of time and the rubble of forgotten guild halls lie secrets that may never fully surface. When fire consumed London's Fishmongers' Hall in the Great Fire of 1666, it didn't just destroy ledgers, it erased centuries of transactions, disputes, and innovations known only to those who handled herring scales and harbor bribes. Similar tragedies unfolded across Europe. Strasbourg's tanners' records dissolved in basement floods. Venetian glassmakers' formulas vanished when Napoleon's troops looted Murano's archives. These weren't just administrative losses, they were fractures in humanity's collective memory, leaving historians to reconstruct guild influence like detectives piecing together a shredded manuscript. Recent breakthroughs offer tantalizing glimpses. In 2018, builders renovating a Brussels townhouse knocked through a wall and uncovered a 15th-century cabinet crammed with vellum scrolls, the lost statutes of the city's leatherworkers' guild. The documents revealed startling details, like a mandated 3-year mourning period for deceased masters, during which their tools hung idle in the workshop as a mark of respect. Even more revealing were the margins, where generations of scribbles showed apprentices practicing signatures or doodling caricatures of grumpy wardens. These weren't dry records, they were snapshots of daily life, proving guilds were as much about human bonds as economic rules. Some discoveries rewrite history entirely. A cache of manuals found beneath Prague's Old Town Hall in 2021 contained metallurgical diagrams suggesting goldsmiths there had developed a primitive form of electrolysis 2 centuries before its official discovery. The technique, described in coded rhymes to deter thieves, allowed them to refine impure gold using vinegar and lead plates. Why wasn't this revolutionary method widely known? Perhaps because the guild that guarded it was wiped out by plague before passing it on, leaving the knowledge to gather dust beneath cobblestones until modern archaeologists brushed it off. The most haunting gaps involve marginalized voices. Women, despite often being barred from formal membership, clearly contributed to guild economies, yet their stories rarely survive intact. A single line in a Strasbourg weaver's ledger mentions a widow Vogt training apprentices in the 1350s, her full role reduced to a footnote. Jewish craftsmen, though technically excluded from Christian guilds, appear fleetingly in tax records as suppliers of specialized dyes or metal alloys, their techniques absorbed without credit. Even the journeymen who actually executed most guild masterpieces remain largely nameless, their labor celebrated collectively while individual genius went unrecorded. Technology is now filling some voids. Multispectral imaging recently deciphered charred pages from a Lyon silk weaver's Guildhall fire, revealing previously unknown dye recipes involving crushed cochineal beetles and fermented walnut husks. Meanwhile, AI pattern recognition scours thousands of medieval contracts to map guild networks, showing how techniques spread along pilgrimage routes rather than trade roads as previously assumed. Each discovery peels back another layer, proving guilds were more innovative and more vulnerable than we imagined. The tragedy isn't just what we've lost, but how much richer our understanding of craftsmanship's evolution could be if those Guildhall shelves had remained intact. Perhaps the greatest mystery isn't the secrets taken, but why some were so fiercely guarded. A recently unearthed oath from a Catalan stonemasons guild threatens death for anyone revealing the measure of the rose, a cryptic phrase now believed to refer to vaulting geometry that balanced Gothic cathedrals. Was this mere paranoia, or did guilds grasp something we've since forgotten? That true mastery thrives not in open shelves, but in the sacred space between teacher and apprentice, where knowledge passes not through ink, but through shared sweat and trust. The lost archives may never give us all the answers, but they've left an unmistakable lesson. History isn't just written by the victorious, it's also hidden by the careful, waiting centuries for the right moment to be found. The echoes of guilds resonate in places we rarely think to look. In the barrister's precise latte art, the electrician's union wage scale, even the handcrafted label on your favorite bourbon. These medieval organizations didn't just vanish, they dissolved into the DNA of modern work, leaving behind invisible blueprints we still follow. Consider how today's apprenticeships in skilled trades, from plumbing to HVAC repair, mirror the guild model's step-by-step mastery, complete with licensing exams that would feel familiar to a Renaissance stonemason. Or notice the way artisan coffee roasters guard their bean sources as fiercely as Venetian glassmakers hoarded their silica recipes. The guild's most enduring innovation wasn't their regulations, but their radical idea that labor could be a shared identity, not just a transaction. Labor movements owe more to guilds than we often admit. The 8-hour workday battles of the 19th century, guilds had already fought, and sometimes won similar limits in medieval Flanders, where weavers' guilds find masters for overworking apprentices by candlelight. Modern collective bargaining tactics from the Writers' Guild of Americas strike strategies to German auto workers' wage tiers are refinements of Guildhall negotiations where craftsmen once haggled over piece rates over ale. Even the gig economy's current struggles with worker classification replay an ancient tension. Are you an independent artisan or a captive laborer? The Guild's answer, a third path combining autonomy with collective support, feels startlingly relevant as Uber drivers and freelance designers search for new models. Yet their legacy also carries cautionary tales. The same exclusivity that protected quality sometimes stifled innovation, like when 16th century printers' guilds resisted movable type to protect scribes. Today's professional licensing boards face similar critiques, does requiring hundreds of hours of training to braid hair or arrange flowers, as some U.S. states do, protect consumers or merely erect barriers. The Guild's greatest failure, their eventual ossification into hereditary clubs, reminds us that any system prioritizing gatekeeping over growth will collapse under its own weight. Perhaps their most subtle influence lies in the language we use without thinking. Masterpiece isn't just a compliment, it's a relic of Guild examination rituals. Journeyman didn't originally mean adequacy, but the hard-won right to travel and learn. Even the word company traces back to companion, the shared bread of guild brothers breaking loaves together. These linguistic fossils remind us how deeply guild values shaped our very conception of work. As automation and AI loom over modern workplaces, the guild story offers unexpected comfort. They survived plagues, wars, and the first industrial revolution by adapting without abandoning their core truth, that human skill, honed through community and time, can never be fully replicated by machines. The next time you admire a hand-stitched leather bag or a perfectly poured pint, you're not just seeing a product, you're witnessing a 1,000-year conversation between craft and commerce. The guilds may have faded, but their fundamental question remains: how do we build economies that value people as much as profits? Your answer might just shape the next chapter of this ancient story. Drop your thoughts below. Have you spotted guild shadows in your world? And if you've enjoyed this dive into history's workshop, hit subscribe to keep exploring the hidden patterns that connect past